On the morning of January 31st, 1945, at Clark Air Base in Luzon, the humid air shimmered under the tropical sun. Major Frank T. McCoy of the U.S. Army Air Forces stood beside a strange sight: a fully intact Japanese Mitsubishi G4M bomber, abandoned by its crew as American troops swept across the airfield. McCoy, commander of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific, had examined dozens of wrecked Japanese aircraft during the campaign. But this one was different. The bomber's polished fuselage gleamed in the sunlight, its long cylindrical frame earning it the Allied nickname Flying Cigar. Nearly 20 meters from nose to tail, with a 25-meter wingspan, it rested on its tricycle landing gear like a massive metallic predator frozen in place. The engines, twin 14-cylinder radial models, looked pristine, untouched by battle or sabotage. This was no wreck dragged from the jungle. It was an operational aircraft, complete and ready for flight, simply left behind. As McCoy and his team began their inspection, what they found would challenge everything the Allies believed about Japanese aircraft design. Opening the inspection panels along the wings, they peered into the fuel tanks and froze. There was nothing inside that resembled protection. No self-sealing layers, no armor, no fire suppression system. Just a paper-thin aluminum skin, barely 2 millimeters thick, holding thousands of liters of aviation fuel. It was, in essence, a flying bomb. McCoy realized that this wasn't an accident or a field modification. This was deliberate engineering. Every system of the bomber reflected a ruthless pursuit of performance at the expense of survivability. It was a philosophy entirely alien to Western design, one that valued range and speed over the safety of its crew. The discovery would send shockwaves through Allied intelligence circles and reshape how the U.S. Air Force viewed Japanese aviation. It revealed not just how Japan fought the war, but why it fought that way, through desperation, daring, and a belief that skill and spirit could compensate for technological limits. To understand how Japan had reached this point, analysts looked back to the beginning, to the morning of December 8, 1941, when the Pacific War erupted. As smoke still drifted over Pearl Harbor, 82 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers and 26 older G3M Nell bombers lifted off from airfields in Formosa. Their destination was Clark Field in the Philippines, America's primary air base in the region. At precisely 12:35 in the afternoon, the Japanese formation appeared over Luzon at an altitude of 20,000 feet, far beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. In perfectly coordinated formation, 27 bombers from the lead group released over 600 bombs across the runways and hangars below. Within moments, waves of Zero fighters followed, sweeping in at treetop level and strafing anything that moved. 17 B-17 Flying Fortresses sat on the ground that morning. 12 were obliterated instantly. Almost every P-40 Warhawk fighter on the field was reduced to twisted metal. In less than an hour, American air power in the Philippines ceased to exist. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few surviving pilots, later recalled watching the attack helplessly from a bomb shelter. "They came in perfect formation, high above us," he wrote. "Then the fighters dropped down and finished everything. We couldn't even get a plane off the ground." The Betty bombers departed untouched, disappearing northward into the blue sky. A chilling demonstration of their precision and range. That range was what made the G4M so remarkable. On its first missions, it struck from bases nearly 500 miles away, a feat no American bomber could match in 1941. Only 2 days after the Clark Field attack, 26 Betty bombers joined an operation that would forever change naval history. Their target was Force Z, a British naval task force built around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. just after noon, Japanese formations began their attack runs. The Bettys carried the formidable Type 91 aerial torpedo, nearly 900 kilograms of weaponry designed for shallow waters. The first torpedoes struck with astonishing accuracy. The Prince of Wales, the pride of the Royal Navy, was hit at least 6 times. The Repulse took 4. Massive explosions tore through their hulls, flooding compartments faster than crews could contain the damage. Within 2 hours, both ships had capsized and sunk. Over 800 British sailors were lost. It was the first time in history that fully armed maneuvering capital ships had been destroyed by aircraft alone. In a single afternoon, Japan had proven what Western theorists had long debated, that air power could annihilate sea power. In the following months, the G4M dominated the skies. Its reach was astonishing. Betty formations struck Darwin, Australia, from airfields 1,500 miles away, distances no Allied bomber could hope to match. They hit Port Moresby over the rugged mountains of New Guinea. They launched raids on Guadalcanal from Rabaul, more than 600 miles distant. The Betty's unmatched range gave Japan flexibility that kept Allied commanders constantly off balance. American and Australian fighters, limited by their shorter range, could rarely intercept the bombers before or after their attacks. Japanese forces, able to strike from bases far beyond reach, dictated the pace of early Pacific operations. Throughout early 1942, the Betty became a symbol of Japan's air supremacy. Elegant, deadly, and seemingly untouchable. But its strength was built on a fragile foundation, the very feature that gave the G4M its range. Its stripped-down, lightweight construction also made it a death trap once Allied fighters began to close the gap. By mid-1942, as American F-4F Wildcats and later F-6F Hellcats appeared in greater numbers, the tide began to turn. The moment of reckoning came in August. 23 Betty bombers from the 4th Air Group took off from Rabaul to strike American positions on Guadalcanal. They never reached their target. Over the island, U.S. fighters intercepted them. In less than 10 minutes, 18 of the bombers were shot down. The survivors limped home, riddled with bullets, their fuel tanks erupting at the slightest hit. Pilots soon realized a grim truth. The Betty could not take damage. Even a handful of .50 caliber rounds could ignite the entire aircraft. American crews began calling it the one-shot lighter, or more darkly, the Flying Zippo. Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn, who led Corsair fighters at Guadalcanal, described his first encounter with them. "We couldn't believe how easily they went down," he recalled. "Hit them anywhere along the fuselage and they'd just explode. It was like hunting targets made of gasoline." The reasons for that fragility would only become fully understood when Allied forces captured intact aircraft. In November 1942, Australian troops seized Japanese airfields at Buna, New Guinea. There, among the wreckage, they found several G4Ms, some barely damaged. Engineers from the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit began a meticulous examination. They discovered the same shocking truth Major McCoy would later confirm at Clark Field. There was no protection whatsoever in the fuel system, no rubber layers to seal bullet holes, no armor around the tanks, no extinguishing systems. Nothing. Every aircraft they examined showed the same pattern. It was not a field improvisation or wartime compromise. It was standard production design. The implications were profound. By that stage of the war, all American bombers, even medium types like the B-25 and B-26, were equipped with self-sealing tanks. These systems, made of layered rubber, would swell and seal themselves when penetrated, preventing fuel leaks and fires. The added weight was considerable, but it saved countless lives. The Japanese had made the opposite choice. Their bombers sacrificed safety for range, shedding hundreds of kilograms in protective material to gain a few hundred miles of distance. That choice made the G4M lethal in the first year of war, and suicidal thereafter. When McCoy's team dismantled the captured Betty at Clark Air Base in early 1945, they spent weeks documenting its systems. Their classified report revealed an aircraft designed with an almost fanatical commitment to efficiency. Every gram of unnecessary weight had been eliminated. The result was a bomber capable of astonishing range and catastrophic vulnerability. It was a symbol of the Imperial Japanese Navy's design philosophy at the time. Trust in the courage of the pilot, not the thickness of his armor. For the Allies, the captured Betty offered more than just technical data. It offered insight into the mindset of an enemy that had once dominated the Pacific. It showed a nation willing to gamble its best men on machines that embodied both brilliance and tragedy. Swift, elegant, and fatally fragile. By the end of the war, the G4M's silhouette was known to every Allied pilot in the Pacific, a long, graceful shape that burned far too easily. What began as Japan's instrument of victory had become a symbol of its strategic blindness. The same design that gave it reach and power in 1941 had doomed it by 1943. In the end, the Flying Cigar was not just a bomber. It was the story of an empire chasing range and glory, only to be consumed by the fire it carried within. In the years leading up to World War II, few aircraft captured both the ambition and the peril of Japan's aviation philosophy as completely as the Mitsubishi G4M, known to Allied pilots by its code name, Betty. Designed to meet the Imperial Japanese Navy's demanding specifications for a long-range attack bomber, the G4M represented the ultimate expression of speed and range over survivability, a machine built for reach, not resilience. Its numbers told a story of extremes. The empty weight stood at just over 6,700 kilograms, remarkably light for a bomber of its class. Fully loaded for combat, the aircraft weighed 9,500 kilograms. Within that frame, engineers fit an astonishing 4,380 liters of aviation fuel, distributed across 8 tanks, 4 in each wing, tucked into the thick central section where the wing joined the fuselage. The design maximized internal volume and efficiency, but it placed the lifeblood of the aircraft directly in the path of enemy fire. A single burst from a fighter's guns could ignite the wing, and there was nothing to stop it. Each tank was bare aluminum, unarmored and unsealed. There was no self-sealing compound to swell and close over bullet holes, no protective barrier to slow fuel leaks. American analysts who later studied captured aircraft calculated that by omitting these safety systems, Japanese engineers saved roughly 500 kilograms in total weight. Those kilograms were instead reinvested in extra fuel, and therefore in extra range. It was a conscious trade, protection sacrificed for endurance. The result was performance few aircraft of the time could match. The G4M could reach speeds exceeding 420 kilometers per hour and climb to altitudes over 8,000 meters. Its range stretched to more than 6,000 kilometers, an unprecedented figure in 1939 for a twin-engine bomber. Manned by a crew of 7, a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners, the Betty could carry either an 800-kilogram bomb load or a torpedo slung beneath its belly. On paper, it appeared to fulfill every promise the Navy had envisioned. In the field, it would reveal the tragic cost of its design. The story of the G4M began in September 1937, when the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a set of requirements that pushed the boundaries of aeronautical possibility. Japan's empire stretched across immense distances, from the home islands to the far edges of the Pacific, and the Navy needed a land-based bomber capable of reaching enemy positions without carrier support. The existing G3M Nell, though effective in earlier campaigns, lacked the range and payload necessary for future operations. The new bomber would need to fly from Formosa to the Philippines, from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, from the Marianas to Midway, distances exceeding anything attempted before. At the time, no Air Force on Earth possessed a bomber with that kind of reach. The specifications were born from both strategic foresight and dangerous assumption. Japanese planners believed their bombers would strike first and fast, achieving surprise before enemy fighters could intervene. They assumed that the vast Pacific would act as a shield, that enemy interceptors would simply lack the range to challenge them. They believed wars would be decided quickly, before industrial powers like the United States could bring their full strength to bear. Every one of those assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong. The man tasked with translating these ambitions into steel and rivets was engineer Kiro Honjo, who succeeded Joji Hattori as chief designer at Mitsubishi. Honjo was not an idealist. He was an engineer shaped by both German rigor and Japanese precision. Having studied bomber design at the Junkers Works in Germany during the early 1930s, he returned to Japan deeply impressed by European manufacturing techniques and the structural efficiency of all-metal aircraft. But he also understood the Navy's specifications left no room for compromise. If the bomber was to achieve the required range, something else would have to be sacrificed. At Mitsubishi's Nagoya facility, Honjo assembled a team of engineers and mathematicians to begin the calculations. Every kilogram was accounted for, every component weighed and evaluated. The math was relentless. 4,780 liters of fuel weighed approximately 3,800 kilograms. To carry that much fuel while maintaining speed and range, the airframe itself had to be as light as possible. Armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and redundant systems, all of them added weight. Every safety feature subtracted range. Every kilogram of protection meant one less kilogram of fuel. The design requirements were in direct opposition. Protection or performance, survival or range. There could be no balance between the two. In the end, Honjo made the only decision that would satisfy the Navy's demands. Armor was abandoned. The fuel tanks would remain unsealed and exposed. There would be no self-sealing rubber lining, no internal fire suppression systems, no armor plating for crew positions or control lines. The G4M would rely on speed, altitude, and range as its only defenses. In an ideal world, those would be enough. On October 23, 1939, the first prototype took to the air. It exceeded expectations. The bomber's range surpassed projections by hundreds of kilometers. Its speed and maneuverability surprised even the test pilots who flew it. The Imperial Navy, pleased with the results, quickly approved full-scale production under the official designation Navy Type 1 Attack Bomber. Mitsubishi began mass production in Nagoya, and by April 1941, the first G4Ms were entering operational service. By December of that year, roughly 180 aircraft were in service across Japanese naval air groups. When war broke out in the Pacific, the Betty formed the backbone of Japan's land-based striking power. It proved devastating in the early months of combat. At Clark Field in the Philippines, and against British forces in the South China Sea, Betty formations struck with speed and precision. In an environment where surprise and initiative still favored Japan, the bomber's long range and heavy payload seemed to justify every design choice. It could strike targets beyond the reach of enemy aircraft, and for a brief moment, it appeared invincible. That illusion did not survive contact with a determined, organized enemy. By mid-1942, as American fighter strength grew and Allied tactics adapted, the G4M's vulnerabilities became impossible to ignore. The Guadalcanal campaign would expose them with brutal clarity. Between August and November 1942, more than 100 G4Ms were destroyed over the island and surrounding waters. Entire squadrons vanished in single missions. On August 8th alone, 18 of 23 aircraft sent to attack Allied ships were shot down, nearly all with total crew loss. Survivors spoke of aircraft igniting instantly, wings shearing away in flames, fuel tanks erupting into fireballs at the first strike of tracer rounds. There were no half measures with the Betty. Either it returned untouched, or it did not return at all. Losses mounted with each passing week. American pilots soon learned that even a few hits to the wings were enough to destroy a Betty. They nicknamed it the Flying Lighter. Japanese airmen, knowing their odds, flew on regardless. By the time Japanese forces withdrew from Guadalcanal in early 1943, more than 700 aviators had been lost in Betty crews alone. The Navy's finest long-range bomber had become a death trap. Desperate to stem the tide, engineers introduced modifications. Beginning with the 663rd aircraft produced in March 1943, Mitsubishi added 30mm sheets of rubber beneath the wings, directly below the fuel tanks. It was a crude imitation of true self-sealing protection. Better than nothing, but far from effective. The change reduced top speed by 9 kilometers per hour and trimmed maximum range by over 300 kilometers. The improvement in survivability was negligible. The rubber slowed small-caliber leaks, but did little against cannon fire or incendiary rounds. The Betty still burned. Later, in October 1944, Mitsubishi introduced the G4M Model 3, which finally incorporated genuine self-sealing tanks. But to fit the additional layers of rubber and structure, fuel capacity had to be reduced to 490 liters, cutting total range by more than 2,000 kilometers. Barely 60 of these improved aircraft were built before Japan's industrial capacity collapsed under Allied bombing. By that point, the skies over the Pacific belonged entirely to the Americans. No amount of protection could save the Betty from a war Japan had already lost. The G4M's story is one of brilliance and tragedy, of engineering ingenuity forced into impossible choices. It was an aircraft born of ambition, designed to span the Pacific, to extend Japan's reach across oceans, but it became a symbol of overreach itself. Its long, slender fuselage and graceful wings concealed fatal fragility. Every flight was a gamble between physics and fire. In the end, the Betty fulfilled its purpose exactly as designed. It achieved range, speed, and payload unmatched by any bomber of its time. But in doing so, it revealed the peril of an engineering philosophy that valued performance above protection. When the skies filled with enemies, when the element of surprise vanished, when the Pacific turned from Japan's oceanic highway into its graveyard, the Betty stood as a haunting lesson in the price of perfection pursued too far. By 1943, the G4M Betty had become both a symbol of Japan's technological achievement and its fatal overconfidence. Its sleek form, long wings, and impressive range had once represented the future of naval aviation. But as the war dragged on, that same design became synonymous with vulnerability. American pilots learned to exploit its weaknesses, and in time, the Betty's destruction became inevitable whenever it appeared in the skies. The aircraft's fragility became so infamous that even its most significant moment in history, one that changed the course of the Pacific, war was defined by its vulnerability. On April 18, 1943, the Betty became the stage for one of the most precisely executed interceptions in aviation history. The death of Admiral Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications revealing Yamamoto's travel itinerary. The message detailed his flight from Repulse to Bougainville, a routine inspection tour meant to boost morale among forward units. The admiral would travel aboard a G4M bomber with a small escort of 0 fighters. To the Americans, It was an opportunity that could not be ignored. From Guadalcanal, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters of the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept the flight. The mission demanded extraordinary precision. The P-38s had to fly more than 400 miles at wave-top height, barely 15 meters above the Pacific, to avoid radar detection. They had to navigate over open ocean with no landmarks, relying entirely on dead reckoning and timing. And they had to arrive at a single point in space and time with perfect synchronization, because Yamamoto's flight would be vulnerable. For only a few minutes, the formation departed. Guadalcanal at 7:25 a.m., under radio silence. Flying just above the waves, the P-38s disappeared into the horizon, guided only by compass, stopwatch, and calculation. At 9:34 a.m., 1 minute ahead of schedule, they reached the intercept point. 2 Betty bombers appeared ahead, escorted by 6 Zeros. Captain Thomas Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke formation to engage the bombers. Barber focused on the lead aircraft, the one carrying Admiral Yamamoto. The Betty took hits to its right wing, exactly where the unprotected fuel tanks were located. Within seconds, the aircraft erupted in flames. Witnesses reported seeing it roll inverted and crash into the jungle below, trailing fire. Yamamoto was found the next day, still seated in his chair, his katana by his side. The second Betty was also destroyed, its fuel tanks ignited by tracer rounds. None of the passengers survived. The mission demonstrated the complete synthesis of American intelligence, planning, and precision. It also highlighted the absolute frailty of Japan's most important aircraft. Once hit, the Betty offered no resistance, no armor, no ceiling, no second chance. Its destruction was instantaneous, inevitable, and total. As the war progressed, the G4M's design philosophy would lead Japan into even more desperate measures. By 1945, with Japan's industrial base shattered and its air power all but destroyed, the Betty was pressed into roles it had never been designed to perform. Among the most tragic of these missions were those involving the MXY-7 Ohka, a rocket-powered suicide weapon intended to strike American ships at impossible speeds. On March 21, 1945, 18 G4M bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying an Ohka beneath its fuselage. The weapon itself was essentially a manned missile, with a 1,200-kilogram warhead and a rocket engine capable of propelling it to over 650 kilometers per hour. The Betty's role was to carry these weapons to within 20 kilometers of the target, at which point the Ohka pilots would detach, ignite their rockets, and dive directly into enemy ships. It was a plan conceived in desperation and executed with tragic futility. The G4Ms, burdened with the enormous weight and drag of the attached weapons, were even slower and less maneuverable than usual. American radar detected the formation more than 100 miles away. F-6F Hellcats from the USS Hornet scrambled to intercept, climbing toward the incoming bombers. When they met, the result was one-sided. The Bettys, unable to maneuver and trailing the cumbersome Ohkas, were slaughtered in minutes. Their unprotected fuel tanks turned every hit into a fireball. Not one bomber survived to reach the release range. Not one Ohka was ever launched. The sea below burned with the wreckage of 18 bombers, their crews, and 15 Ohka pilots, 137 men in total. The mission's failure illustrated with haunting clarity the final consequence of a design that had always favored reach over resilience. The range that once promised strategic dominance now only carried men farther to die. As Japan's empire collapsed, the Betty's story approached its symbolic conclusion. On August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito's radio address announcing Japan's surrender, 2 white-painted G4M bombers rose into the morning sky from Atsugi Airfield. Across their fuselages and wings, green crosses replaced the red rising sun. These were the aircraft designated Bataan 1 and Bataan 2, carrying Japanese representatives to negotiate surrender terms with Allied forces. The symbolism was unmistakable. The white paint and green crosses signaled peaceful intent. The call sign, Bataan, was chosen with deliberate irony, named for the site of one of Japan's most infamous victories, where American troops had surrendered in 1942. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing that name carried Japan's own emissaries of defeat. Lieutenant Densudo piloted one of the aircraft, a G6M Model 1, an unarmed transport variant converted from the standard bomber. The bomb bay had been replaced with passenger seating. The gun positions were sealed. The aircraft carried no weapons, no armor, and no instruments of war. Its only cargo was surrender documents and the officers who would deliver them. Escorted by American fighters, the two White Bettys flew the 1,000-kilometer journey to Ieshima, where the delegation would transfer to an American C-54 for the flight to Manila. The image of the White Bettys against the Pacific sky marked a quiet, poignant end to the aircraft's wartime service. The same bomber that had launched Japan's war now carried its surrender. The circle was complete. From a weapon of conquest to a vessel of submission, the Betty's transformation reflected Japan's own arc through the war. Brilliant at the beginning, desperate at the end, and consumed by its own limitations. In total, Mitsubishi produced approximately 2,114 G4Ms across all variants, though some records list up to 2,435 when including prototypes and conversions. The Model 1, built from 1941 to early 1943, accounted for roughly half that number. It retained the original unprotected tanks and the 4,180-liter fuel capacity that gave it unmatched range but guaranteed disaster in combat. With a top speed of 428 kilometers per hour and a maximum range exceeding 6,000 kilometers, it was the longest-ranged bomber in service anywhere in the world at the time. The Model 2 followed, with improved engines and expanded fuel capacity to 6,490 liters, extending range even further. It reached 437 kilometers per hour at top speed, but kept the same design flaws. Performance improved, survivability did not. Only with the Model 3, introduced in late 1944, did engineers finally install true self-sealing fuel tanks. But these additions came at the cost of range and payload. Capacity dropped to 4,490 liters, and maximum range fell to about 3,640 kilometers, nearly half the reach of the first model. Barely 60 of these improved bombers were built before production ended. It was too little, too late. The transport variant, the G6M, added roughly 30 aircraft, repurposed for liaison and communications duties. By then, Japan's industrial capacity had collapsed under Allied bombing. Production that had peaked at 100 bombers per month in 1943 dwindled to a trickle in 1945, as factories were destroyed and resources diverted to fighter production for homeland defense. Of the roughly 2,400 G4Ms built, only a few dozen survived to the end of the war. The rest lay at the bottom of the sea, buried in Pacific jungles, or burned on island airstrips from New Guinea to Okinawa. Few aircraft better embodied the paradox of Japan's wartime engineering: brilliant in concept, fatal in execution. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of Japanese airmen perished in Betty bombers, many consumed by the very fuel that gave them their range. Survivors later spoke of flying missions with full knowledge that a single hit could end them. One pilot, Petty Officer Masao Sato, who flew 28 combat sorties before being reassigned to training duties, described it simply: "The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. The comparison with Allied bombers underscored the gulf between two philosophies. American aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-25 Mitchell carried heavy armor plating, self-sealing tanks, and redundant systems. These additions added thousands of kilograms to their empty weight, but preserved the lives of their crews. In the B-17, steel armor protected the cockpit, the bombardier's station, and the gunner's positions. Its fuel tanks sealed automatically when hit. Fire suppression systems were standard. The Betty had none of this. Its skin was thin aluminum, its tanks bare metal, its crew unshielded. It relied on faith in speed, on the hope of avoiding fire rather than enduring it. And when that hope failed, as it inevitably did, the result was almost always fatal. By the end of the war, the Betty stood as both an engineering triumph and a moral lesson, a reminder that performance without protection is a hollow achievement. It was a bomber designed to span oceans, and it did. But it carried its crews across those oceans only to die within sight of their targets. In its elegant lines and tragic history, the G4M captured the spirit of Japan's wartime aviation. Daring, brilliant, and doomed, American wartime studies demonstrated the effectiveness of crew protection with undeniable precision. Statistical analysis revealed that body armor reduced fatal chest wounds from 36% to just 8%. Self-sealing fuel tanks decreased fire-related deaths by similar margins. Aircraft equipped with protected fuel systems survived at rates 3 to 4 times higher than those without protected crew positions increased the odds of survival by shielding men from shrapnel and small arms fire. Armored glass prevented fatal injuries in head-on attacks. Compartmentalized bulkheads stopped fire and blast from spreading through the fuselage. It was a holistic approach to survival, a doctrine that treated trained crews as irreplaceable assets. Planes could be rebuilt. Skilled aviators could not. The protection came at a cost, more than 1,000 pounds of extra weight in most American bombers. But U.S. industry absorbed that penalty with ease. American factories produced over 12,000 B-17s and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators. The scale of production allowed the United States to field heavily protected bombers without sacrificing performance or numbers. Japan reached a very different conclusion. The design of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty reflected a philosophy that valued range and striking power over survival. Its engineers believed that surprise, speed, and initiative would protect crews better than armor ever could. They assumed the enemy would remain unprepared, that the war would be short, and that offensive momentum would be decisive. Every one of those assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. By mid-1942, American fighters were numerous and fast enough to intercept Betty bombers with ease. By the end of that year, U.S. pilots had mastered every weakness in the aircraft's design. By 1943, Betty missions had become suicide operations, and by 1944, they could no longer operate safely in daylight. The mathematics of the Betty's war were written in fire and loss. Its range meant nothing when bombers exploded before reaching their targets. Its speed meant nothing when American interceptors could find them hundreds of miles out. Its payload meant nothing when entire formations were destroyed before releasing a single weapon. When American engineers examined the captured Betty at Clark Field in early 1945, tail number 76312, per tutor, they discovered that its fuel tanks were unprotected not by mistake, but by design. This was no oversight or production shortcut. It was an intentional choice made years earlier. Japanese engineers had built exactly what they were told to build: a bomber with extraordinary range and speed, achieved through radical weight reduction. In 1937, those choices made sense. Japan expected a short war fought under conditions it could control. Armor and self-sealing tanks would have limited the aircraft's range, undermining the very mission it was meant to fulfill. But by 1942, those assumptions had collapsed, under the pressure of total war against an industrial superpower. The Betty became a symbol of Japan's willingness to accept catastrophic loss in pursuit of tactical advantage, a weapon built on the premise that achieving the mission mattered more than returning home. When American technicians examined the aircraft, they weren't just studying engineering. They were looking at the physical embodiment of a national mindset, one that prioritized reach and striking power over survival and sustainability. The Betty served from the first day of the Pacific War to its very last. It struck airfields at Clark, sank Allied ships, and ranged across the Pacific with a reach no other bomber of its time could match. But its ultimate legacy is written in its loss rates. By 1945, only a handful remained. Thousands had burned, consumed by the fires ignited in their own fuel tanks. The crew of the Betty found at Clark Field had abandoned their aircraft and lived. Most were not so fortunate. They flew their missions knowing the risks. They boarded unarmored planes and crossed vast distances, and many never returned. One surviving flight petty officer, who completed 28 combat missions, later said simply, "The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do." The contrast with Allied bombers was stark. The American B-17 Flying Fortress featured armored plating, reinforced bulkheads, and self-sealing fuel tanks as standard equipment. Its waist gunners, pilots, and bombardiers were all protected by layers of steel and glass. The B-25 Mitchell, though smaller, carried similar armor and weighed nearly 2,000 kilograms more than the Betty as a result. That extra weight was accepted as the cost of bringing crews home alive. The results spoke for themselves. American bombers returned from missions damaged but intact. Crews survived, learned, and flew again. Japanese bombers vanished in fireballs, their crews gone forever. The Betty was faster and lighter, but it was also fatally fragile. Its story is not just about engineering. It's about philosophy, about how nations define acceptable loss, and how they balance ambition with compassion. The Betty's long range of 6,000 kilometers meant nothing when its fuel tanks turned it into a flying torch. Its impressive speed was meaningless when enemy radar and interceptors closed the skies. Its bomb load was irrelevant when no one survived to deliver it. The G4M's design was a triumph of aeronautical engineering and a tragedy of human cost. It embodied a belief that technological brilliance could substitute for protection, that success depended only on performance, not survivability. The Pacific War proved otherwise. By 1945, Japan's skies were filled not with returning bombers, but with wreckage. The United States, which had prioritized protection, continued to field wave after wave of aircraft. Japan, which had sacrificed its crews for range and speed, had built an air force that destroyed itself through attrition. When American engineers inspected that captured Betty at Clark Field, they saw more than a machine. They saw the story of Japan's defeat written in rivets and fuel lines. The bomber was not poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed for the wrong kind of war. And that single truth explains the Pacific War's outcome more clearly than any battle map or casualty chart. The United States built aircraft to bring its crews home. Japan built aircraft to reach their targets, whatever the cost. In the end, the side that valued life over performance endured. The side that sacrificed survival for reach burned itself out in the skies over the Pacific. The Betty bomber's legacy endures not as a failure of technology, but as a lesson in philosophy, a reminder that in war, as in design, the measure of success is not how far you can go, but whether you can come home.